the valley beyond judgment. They called her a fool for marrying a poor widower with 3 hungry daughters. The whole town watched Lydia trade comfort for hardship, security for uncertainty. But when eviction papers arrived that scorching July morning, when Caleb's calloused hands trembled holding that final notice, Lydia found a letter hidden in his dead wife's Bible. A letter meant to be opened only when hope ran dry. It spoke of land, of water, of a valley no one else knew existed. Sometimes the greatest discoveries wait beyond the edge of everyone's cruelty. Sometimes you have to lose everything the world values to find what actually matters. Welcome to this story of courage, hidden valleys, and love that defends what others dismiss. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, comment your city below. I want to see how far this journey reaches. Now let's begin where judgment was heaviest and hope seemed thinnest. The August sun hammered down on Ridge Creek like divine punishment, turning the main street into a furnace of dust and bitter judgment. Lydia Monroe stood outside Patterson's general store, her cotton dress already damp between her shoulder blades, watching the town matrons cluster near the water trough. Their voices carried on the dry wind, sharp, deliberate, meant to reach her ears. "Married that Caleb Brennan," Mrs. Whitmore said, adjusting her parasol with theatrical precision. "A widower with 3 girls and not 2 coins to rub together. What kind of woman chooses that?" "The desperate kind," Mrs. Patterson replied, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Though I suppose at 26, options grow thin." Lydia's fingers tightened around her market basket, but she didn't turn. She'd learned in the 3 months since her wedding that dignity meant not giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. The leather handle bit into her palm as she continued down the boardwalk, her worn boots making soft sounds against sun-bleached wood. The truth was simpler and more complicated than their gossip allowed. She'd married Caleb Brennan because when he'd looked at her across the church social last spring, she'd seen something the town had trained itself not to recognize. Genuine goodness worn smooth by grief and hard work. His proposal had been awkward, honest, delivered on the porch of her boarding house with his hat crushed between work-roughened hands. "I ain't got much to offer," he'd said, his voice low and careful. 3 daughters who need a mother's hand. A house that needs repairs I can't afford. Work that's unpredictable at best." He'd paused then, meeting her eyes with unexpected directness. "But I'd treat you right. I'd work myself to dust before I'd let you or the girls go without. And I'd be grateful every day you chose us." The matrons hadn't understood. How could they? They measured worth in property and position, in the size of a man's bank account, and the quality of his Sunday suit. They couldn't see what Lydia saw, that Caleb's poverty was circumstantial, not constitutional, that his daughters Emma, Rose, and little Sarah weren't burdens but bright-eyed girls who deserved better than the world's indifference. The house Caleb rented sat at the eastern edge of town, a weathered structure that leaned slightly, as if tired of standing against the wind. Lydia approached it now, noting the way the fence post tilted, how the gate hung crooked on its hinges. Small failures of maintenance that added up to visible poverty. But inside she'd created something the town couldn't see from the street. Emma met her at the door, 9 years old and serious beyond her years. "Mama Lydia, Rose finished her sums, all of them. Can she have the honey cake you promised?" Lydia smiled despite the heat, despite the gossip still ringing in her ears. "She can. And you can help me with supper while your father finishes at the lumberyard." The interior was clean, sparse, organized with the precision of people who owned little and valued everything. Lydia had brought almost nothing to the marriage, a few dresses, her mother's quilt, a small collection of books, but she'd brought energy and purpose. The windows now had proper curtains sewn from cheap muslin. The floor bore the shine of daily sweeping. The girls' clothes, though patched and faded, were mended with tiny invisible stitches. Rose appeared from the back room, 7 years old, with her mother's dark curls and her father's thoughtful eyes. "I carried the 2 just like you showed me." "Clever girl." Lydia set down her basket and retrieved the small honey cake she'd bought with coins saved from careful management. She divided it into 4 precise pieces, 1 for each daughter, 1 for herself. Caleb would insist he didn't need sweetness, would claim he wasn't hungry, would give his portion to Sarah. The youngest appeared then, barely 4, trailing a rag doll that had been Emma's, then Rose's, now hers. The doll's dress showed 3 generations of careful repair. Sarah climbed onto the bench beside Lydia, her small hand reaching up automatically. Lydia took it, feeling the complete trust in that gesture, a trust she'd earned inch by inch over these 3 months. "Where's Papa?" Sarah asked around a mouthful of cake. "Working hard so we can have what we need." Lydia smoothed the child's hair, noting how it needed trimming. Another task for the endless list. "He'll be home when the sun starts setting." But when the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust, Caleb didn't appear. Lydia kept supper warm, trying not to let worry show on her face, as the girls set the table with their mismatched plates and bent forks. When he finally arrived, the light had faded to purple dusk. Lydia heard his boots on the porch, heard the heaviness in his tread, and knew before he entered that something had shifted in their precarious balance. He stood in the doorway, a tall man made taller by thinness, his work clothes dusty and sweat-stained. His face carried lines that hadn't been there that morning, new geography of stress etched around his eyes and mouth. "Girls, wash up for bed," Lydia said quietly. "Quickly now." They heard the tone, recognized it, and obeyed without protest. When their soft voices faded behind the bedroom door, Caleb finally moved, sinking onto the bench with the controlled collapse of a man whose strength had limits. "Lost the lumberyard job." His voice came out rough, scraped raw by dust and disappointment. "Anderson's nephew came into town. Family first," he said. Lydia's stomach dropped, but her hand stayed steady as she set a plate before him. "Eat. Then we'll talk." "Can't afford to eat." But even as he said it, his body betrayed him, reaching for the fork with the automatic motion of exhaustion. "You can't afford not to." She poured water from the pitcher, watching him drink it down like a man who'd crossed a desert. "What else?" He ate 3 bites before answering, and she didn't rush him. "Rent's due in 2 weeks. We're already a month behind. Mr. Hutchins came by the yard today, said if we can't pay both months by the 1st of September, he'll need the house for someone who can." The numbers ran through Lydia's mind with cruel clarity. 2 months' rent was $18, more than Caleb could earn in a month, even with steady work. And work in Ridge Creek had never been steady, especially not for a man the town had decided to pity rather than employ. "I've got $3 saved," she said, "from the mending work. That's for the girls." His voice carried the flat exhaustion of defeat. "For shoes before winter, for keeping a roof over their heads." She sat across from him, waiting until he met her eyes. "We'll find a way. You'll find work." "Where?" The question emerged bitter, backed by months of doors closed in his face, of jobs given to men with fewer mouths to feed, of charity offered with condescension he couldn't afford to refuse. "I've asked everywhere. Twice. 3 times. They see me coming, and suddenly there's nothing available." Lydia had seen it too, the way shopkeepers found reasons to step away when Caleb approached, how men who needed help would rather struggle alone than hire someone the town had marked as unfortunate. Poverty in Ridge Creek wasn't just about lacking money, it was about lacking worth in the eyes of people who confused wealth with virtue. "Then we'll go somewhere else." She said it simply, as if suggesting they walk to the next town rather than admitting they might lose everything. With what? Caleb pushed the plate away, appetite disappearing under the weight of reality. "Can't afford a wagon, can't afford supplies for travel, can't take 3 little girls on the road with nothing." They sat in silence as darkness filled the windows and a single candle burned low between them. In the next room, Lydia heard the girls' whispered conversation, Emma trying to reassure her sisters, her young voice carrying a responsibility no 9-year-old should bear. "I'm sorry." Caleb's voice cracked on the words. "You married me thinking I could provide, thinking I'd find a way. Instead, I'm dragging you down with us." "Stop." The command came sharp enough to lift his head. "I married you with my eyes open, Caleb Brennan. I knew the situation. I chose it anyway, and I didn't choose it expecting you to magically solve everything alone." "Then what did you choose?" The question carried real confusion, real need to understand. "I chose partnership. I chose those 3 girls in there who deserved someone to fight for them. I chose a man who works himself to exhaustion trying to do right by his family." She reached across the table, covering his work-scarred hand with hers. The town thinks I'm a fool. Let them. They've been wrong about bigger things. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite hope, but something steadier. The kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose except dignity. There's something I need to show you. He stood, moving to the small trunk that held his few possessions. From beneath a layer of folded clothes, his Sunday shirt, a spare pair of work pants, he withdrew a wooden box barely larger than his palm. Lydia watched as he opened it with careful reverence, his thick fingers unusually gentle. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a folded letter. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. He handed it to her without speaking. The handwriting was feminine, flowing despite obvious effort. The date read March 1867, more than 7 years ago. My dearest Caleb, if you're reading this, I'm gone and times have grown desperate. I made you promise not to open this letter unless you had no other choice, and I trust you've kept that promise because you're a man of your word. The land exists. Everything my father told me is true. The valley beyond the Three Sisters Peaks, where the creek runs year-round and the cabin still stands. It's a hard journey, 3 days through difficult country, but it's there, real, waiting. I couldn't go when I was well enough to travel. The pregnancy, then Sarah's birth, then the sickness that wouldn't leave. But you can. When there's nothing left here, when the town's closed every door, take our girls and go. The directions are on the back of this letter. Follow them exactly. The land was my father's claim, filed properly but never registered in town records because he didn't trust the land office clerk. The deed is in the tin box beneath the hearthstone in the cabin. Everything legal, everything yours by right of my inheritance. Don't let pride keep you here when hope exists elsewhere. Don't let shame prevent you from claiming what belongs to our daughters. Go. Build the life there I wished we could build together. With all my love, Margaret. Lydia read it twice, her heart accelerating with each word. She turned the letter over, finding a hand-drawn map annotated with careful directions. North past Wilson's Creek, east at the forked cottonwood. Follow the ridge until the land drops. Look for 3 peaks in a row, like sisters standing together. The valley lies beyond. Why didn't you go before? She asked the question carefully, not wanting to sound accusatory. Because Margaret asked me not to open it unless I had no choice. But Caleb's voice carried the weight of 7 years' faith. Because I kept thinking things would get better here. Because traveling with 3 small children into unknown country is dangerous, and I couldn't risk them on a hope I couldn't verify. And now? Now we're out of choices. He met her eyes directly. Now staying is the bigger risk. Now they're older, stronger, and now I have you, someone who can help me keep them safe on the road. Lydia looked down at the letter again, at the careful directions written by a dying woman who'd wanted to give her family one final gift. A valley where water ran year-round, a cabin already built, land that belonged to them by right, even if the town didn't know it existed. How far? She asked. 3 days hard riding, 4 or 5 on foot with children. He paused. Maybe a week to be safe. Supplies? Everything we can carry, everything we can't, we leave behind. His jaw tightened, which is almost everything. Lydia's mind raced through calculations. They could afford minimal supplies, dried beans, flour, a little salt pork. They'd need bedrolls, cooking gear, a single change of clothes each. Water would be the main concern. And keeping 3 young girls moving forward through difficult country when they were tired, scared, hungry. When? She asked. Caleb blinked, clearly expecting more resistance. You're willing. I'm willing to try for something better than eviction and charity. She folded the letter carefully, handing it back to him. I'm willing to believe your Margaret knew what she was talking about, and I'm willing to walk away from this town before it grinds us to nothing. For the first time since he'd arrived home, something like relief crossed his face. We'd leave everything, everything we can't carry. What are we leaving that's worth more than possibility? She gestured around the spare room. Borrowed furniture in a rented house? Plates that don't match? The privilege of being pitied by people who've never known real hardship? The girls will adapt. Children are stronger than we give them credit for. She stood, moving to the bedroom door. But we tell them tonight. We don't make this choice without letting them understand what we're doing and why. Caleb followed her to the bedroom, where Emma, Rose, and Sarah lay in the double bed they shared, supposedly asleep. But 3 pairs of eyes gleamed in the darkness, wide and wakeful. "We know you're not sleeping," Lydia said gently. "Come, we need to talk as a family." They gathered around the table again, the candle burning lower, casting moving shadows across young faces trying very hard to look brave. Caleb explained simply, honestly, the lost job, the rent they couldn't pay, the choice between staying and leaving. "Where would we go?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the fear Lydia could see in her eyes. "To land that belonged to your mother's family." Caleb spread the map on the table. A valley past the Three Sisters Peaks, a place with water and a cabin and space to start over. "Is it far?" Rose leaned closer, tracing the penciled route with one finger. 3 or 4 days walking, through country we don't know well." He didn't soften the truth. "It won't be easy. You'll get tired. Your feet will hurt. You might get scared." "Will we be together?" Sarah's small voice cut through the practical concerns. "Every step." Lydia pulled the child onto her lap. "We'll be together the whole way. That's the most important part." Emma looked between her father and stepmother, her serious face even more solemn in the candlelight. "If we stay, we lose the house?" "Yes." "And if we go, we might not find what Mama wrote about?" "That's possible," Caleb admitted. "The letter's 7 years old. Things might have changed. But if we stay, we know we'll lose everything," Emma said slowly, working through the logic. "And if we go, we might find something better?" "That's the truth of it." The 9-year-old straightened her shoulders, looking suddenly older. "Then we should go. We should try." Rose nodded immediate agreement. Sarah, not entirely understanding but trusting her sisters, added her small voice to the consensus. Lydia felt something tight in her chest release slightly. Not hope exactly. Hope seemed too fragile for what they faced, but determination, the solid knowledge that they were choosing action over surrender. "We leave in 4 days," Caleb said. "That gives me time to sell what we can, buy what we need. We tell no one where we're going. As far as the town knows, we're just moving on, maybe to Denver, maybe to family elsewhere. We don't mention the valley." "Why not?" Rose asked. "Because if it's real, if it's as good as your mama believed, then it's ours. And the fewer people who know about it, the safer that stays." He looked at each daughter in turn. "Can you keep the secret? Can you be strong enough not to tell even your friends goodbye properly?" 3 heads nodded, solemn as an oath. Over the next 4 days, Lydia watched Caleb transform desperation into careful planning. He sold their furniture back to the second-hand dealer who'd sold it to him, taking a loss but gaining coin they needed. He bartered his good saw for trail supplies. He spoke quietly with men who might buy the few tools he couldn't carry, never mentioning their destination, always vague about their plans. Lydia gathered what they'd need and nothing more. 3 sturdy dresses for herself, all dark colors that wouldn't show the dirt of travel. 4 dresses each for the girls, their warmest shawls, their sturdiest shoes. She packed the medical supplies she'd gathered over months. Willow bark, clean bandages, the small bottle of laudanum she'd been saving against emergency. She wrapped her mother's quilt in oilcloth, the only truly personal item she refused to leave behind. The town watched with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Whitmore actually approached her outside the general store on the 3rd day. "Leaving us, Mrs. Brennan?" The question dripped with false concern. "Moving on to better prospects," Lydia replied evenly, not slowing her pace. "I'm sure that's wise. After all, some situations can't be improved upon, only escaped from." The implication hung in the air that Lydia was running from a mistake rather than toward possibility. "Thank you for your concern," Lydia said, her voice perfectly pleasant, perfectly meaningless. "I'll be sure to remember your kindness." She didn't look back to see Mrs. Whitmore's reaction. She had more important things to attend to than the satisfaction of small minds. On the evening before their departure, Lydia did one final inventory. 2 canvas packs held their supplies: dried beans, flour, cornmeal, salt pork, coffee, a small sack of sugar, dried apples. Bedrolls lashed tight, a cooking pot, a pan, 2 tin plates, 3 tin cups, utensils. Matches wrapped in oilcloth. The precious letter with its map. Caleb's rifle and ammunition. A hunting knife. Rope. Everything chosen for necessity, nothing for comfort. The girls sat watching, their own small bundles beside them. Emma had chosen to bring her mother's silver hairbrush, the one nice thing Margaret had owned. Rose carefully wrapped her favorite book of fairy tales. Sarah clutched her rag doll with fierce determination. "We can only carry so much," Lydia reminded them gently. "I know," Emma said. "This is what matters." That night, Lydia lay beside Caleb in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the wind moving through the eaves. Tomorrow they would walk away from the known world into territory that existed only in a dead woman's careful directions. "Are we doing the right thing?" Caleb's whisper came soft in the darkness. "We're doing the only thing." Lydia found his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "The town already decided our story. They decided you'd fail, I'd regret, the girls would suffer. Nothing we do here changes that narrative." "And if the valley doesn't exist? If the letter was Margaret's fever dream? Then we find somewhere else. Somewhere the story isn't already written." She squeezed his hand. "But I think it exists. I think she knew exactly what she was giving you." "Why?" "Because dying mothers don't waste their final words on empty promises. Because she loved you enough to give you an escape route even after she was gone. Because that letter reads like certainty, not hope." Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then, "I'm grateful you married me, Lydia Monroe. Even if this all goes wrong, I'm grateful you chose us." "Lydia Brennan," she corrected softly, "and I'd make the same choice tomorrow." They rose before dawn, moving quietly through the dark house. The girls woke without complaint, dressing in their travel clothes with unusual solemnity. Lydia braided their hair tight, practical for the road. She made coffee and cornmeal mush, insisting everyone eat well before they started. The sun was just breaking over the eastern hills when they stepped out onto the porch for the last time. Caleb locked the door and pushed the key through the mail slot. Mr. Hutchins could collect his property whenever he wished. They'd left nothing behind worth claiming. They walked through town as it woke, passing the general store, the church, the houses of people who'd never quite made room for them. A few early risers watched from windows, their curiosity evident but unspoken. Let them wonder. Let them gossip. By sunset, the Brennan family would be beyond the reach of their speculation. At the northern edge of town, where the road narrowed to a trail leading into open country, Caleb stopped. He turned, looking back at Ridge Creek one final time. Lydia watched his face, seeing him mentally close a door on this chapter of his life. "Papa," Emma tugged his sleeve. "Are we ready?" He looked down at his daughter, then at Rose and Sarah, then at Lydia. His expression shifted from goodbye to forward, from ending to beginning. "We're ready." He adjusted the pack on his shoulders, picked up Sarah to ride on his back for the first mile, and turned his face toward the unknown hills. "Let's find what your mother left for us." They walked into the morning sun, into country that held either promise or disappointment, into a future they were choosing rather than accepting. Behind them, Ridge Creek went about its day, already forgetting the poor widower and his foolish wife and their 3 small daughters. But ahead lay possibility measured in Margaret's careful directions and the faith of people with nothing left to lose except hope. The real journey was just beginning. The first day taught them what their bodies could endure. The trail north of Ridge Creek started deceptively easy, a worn wagon road that angled through scrub brush and scattered cottonwoods. But by mid-morning, when the sun climbed high enough to press down like a physical weight, the road had narrowed to a footpath threading through rocky terrain that seemed designed to punish travelers. Sarah lasted 2 hours on her own feet before her steps began to drag. Caleb lifted her without comment, settling her small weight across his shoulders despite the pack already straining his back. Emma and Rose walked on either side of Lydia, their faces set with determination that broke her heart even as it made her proud. "Tell us about the valley," Rose said around noon, when the heat had become oppressive and conversation seemed the only distraction from discomfort. "What did Mama's letter say exactly?" Lydia knew the child was asking not for information but for hope, something to focus on besides blistered feet and dry throat. It said the creek runs year-round. That means always water, even in summer. Trees for shade, grass for grazing if we ever get animals. A cabin already built, so we'd have shelter right away. What kind of trees? Emma asked, picking up her sister's strategy. The letter didn't specify, but this far north, likely pine and aspen in the high country. Maybe cottonwood and willow near the water. Lydia scanned the landscape ahead, where the flat scrubland was beginning to give way to rolling hills. We'll know when we get there. How much further today? Rose's voice had gone small, tired. Caleb answered from ahead, his words steady despite the exertion of carrying both child and pack. We walk until the sun starts dropping. Then we find a place with water and make camp. One step at a time, Rosie. That's how you cover distance. One step, then another. They found water 2 hours before sunset, a narrow creek cutting through a stand of cottonwoods. The trees provided blessed shade, and the water ran clear enough to drink after boiling. Caleb set Sarah down carefully, then lowered his pack with visible relief. Sweat had soaked through his shirt, darkening the fabric across his shoulders and down his spine. Girls, gather firewood, Lydia directed, already unpacking the cooking supplies. Small sticks and dry grass for kindling. Bigger pieces for keeping the fire going. Stay where we can see you. They scattered with the restored energy of children who'd reached the day's destination, their earlier exhaustion temporarily forgotten. Lydia watched them go, then turned to find Caleb sitting heavily against a cottonwood trunk, his eyes closed. "Let me see your feet," she said quietly. "They're fine." "Caleb, let me see them." He unlaced his boots slowly, wincing as the leather pulled away from swollen flesh. His socks were dark with sweat and showed rust-colored stains where blisters had formed and broken. Lydia felt her stomach tighten but kept her expression neutral. "We'll wash them. Wrap them in clean cloth tonight. Tomorrow you'll trade off carrying Sarah with me. We can't have you unable to walk." She kept her tone matter-of-fact, medical. "And we all need to check our feet every night. Blisters left untended become infected. Infection becomes serious fast." "Yes, ma'am." A ghost of humor touched his voice. "Didn't know I married a field surgeon." "You married someone practical enough to keep you alive." She retrieved the medical supplies, the clean bandages she'd packed for exactly this purpose. "Now sit still and let me work." The girls returned with armloads of wood, and Lydia set them to building the fire while she tended Caleb's feet. The domesticity of it struck her, sitting in the wilderness, washing her husband's blisters while children argued quietly about the best way to stack kindling. They could have been anywhere, doing anything, just a family going about the ordinary business of caring for each other. Except they weren't anywhere. They were in unclaimed country, traveling toward a destination that might not exist, with supplies that wouldn't last forever, and children who trusted the adults to know what they were doing. Supper was beans and salt pork cooked until the beans softened, eaten from tin plates with the kind of hunger that made even simple food taste good. The girls ate methodically, too tired for their usual chatter. Sarah fell asleep with her plate still half full, slumping against Emma's shoulder. "Bedrolls," Lydia said softly. "Everyone check your feet first. Any blisters? Any sore spots? You tell me now." Rose had the beginning of a blister on her left heel. Emma's feet showed the same hardening calluses as her father's, the mark of someone who'd spent years doing more walking than riding. Sarah's small feet were red but unbroken, protected by shoes that had once been Rose's, before that Emma's, worn soft by multiple owners. Lydia spread their bedrolls close to the fire, arranging the girls between herself and Caleb. The temperature would drop as night deepened, and their shared body heat would matter. She lay listening to the creek's murmur, the occasional crack of settling firewood, the night sounds of insects and distant animal movement. "First day done," Caleb murmured beside her. 3 or 4 more to go." "We made it," Lydia replied. "That's what counts. We made it." The second day started before dawn, when the light was still gray and uncertain. Lydia woke the girls gently, insisting they eat cornmeal mush and drink water before they started walking. Her own body ached in new places, her shoulders from the pack's weight, her calves from yesterday's climbing, her feet despite careful attention. But they moved. They followed the creek north until it bent east, then struck out across open country using the map's careful directions. The landscape changed gradually. the flat scrubland rising into genuine hills, the scattered vegetation thickening into stands of juniper and pine. By midday, they reached the forked cottonwood Margaret had marked. It stood massive and ancient, its trunk splitting into two equally large trees about 6 feet up. Someone, Margaret's father presumably, had carved an X into the bark where the split began. Time had tried to heal the mark, but it remained visible, a deliberate sign saying someone had passed this way before, someone had meant for others to follow. "This is good," Caleb said, studying the map and the tree. "This means the directions are accurate, means we're on the right path." They rested in the cottonwood's shade, rationing water carefully. The girls leaned against each other, too tired to play, too young to fully understand the enormity of what they were attempting. Lydia watched them and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier. These children were trusting adults to lead them somewhere better, trusting that the hardship of travel would be worth the destination. "Tell us a story," Sarah asked, her small voice drowsy with heat and exhaustion, like Mama used to. Caleb's expression flickered with old pain, but Emma jumped in before the silence could grow awkward. "Mama Lydia knows stories, don't you?" Lydia hadn't planned on this role, but she recognized its necessity. Stories were currency on hard journeys, something to spend when physical resources ran low. "I know one about a girl who walked a very long way to find something precious. Would you like to hear it?" 3 heads nodded, and she began talking, spinning a tale she half remembered from her own childhood and half invented as she went. A girl searching for a garden that grew in impossible places. Obstacles overcome through cleverness rather than strength. A destination earned through persistence and faith. She kept the story simple, hopeful, age-appropriate, and when she finished, the girls seemed lighter somehow, as if the narrative had given them renewed energy. They walked through the afternoon, climbing steadily now as the land rose toward the distant peaks. The 3 sisters were visible on the horizon, 3 mountains standing in a row, their shapes distinctive even from miles away. Margaret's map marked them clearly, and seeing them made the destination feel suddenly real, no longer abstract hope but actual geography they could aim for. But the climb was taking its toll. Rose stumbled twice in an hour, catching herself on rocks that scraped her palms. Emma's face had gone pale beneath the trail dust, her breathing labored. Sarah, riding on Lydia's back now, had stopped asking questions and simply clung, her small arms tight around Lydia's neck. When they found water again, a spring bubbling from rocks halfway up a hillside, Caleb called the halt earlier than planned. "We camp here. No point pushing until someone gets hurt." They were all too tired to argue. Lydia helped the girls wash trail dust from their faces and hands, checked everyone's feet again, applied fresh bandages where needed. Caleb built the fire while she cooked, their movements synchronizing into efficient partnership. After supper, as twilight painted the sky purple and the first stars appeared, Emma spoke up from her bedroll. "Papa, do you think Mama can see us? Where we are? What we're doing?" The question hung in the cooling air, weighted with the grief none of them had fully processed. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried careful honesty. "I think if she can, she's glad we're trying. Glad we're not giving up." He looked at his eldest daughter, then at Rose and Sarah. "Your mama was the bravest person I ever knew, strong in ways that didn't show on the outside. She wouldn't want us to stay in a place that ground us down. She'd want us to fight for something better." "Is that why she wrote the letter?" Rose asked. "Because she wanted us to be able to fight?" "That's exactly why." Caleb's jaw tightened with emotion he was struggling to contain. She knew times might get hard after she was gone, knew the town might not be kind. So she gave us an escape route, a chance at a fresh start. "I miss her," Sarah said simply, stating fact without drama. "Me too, baby. Every day." Caleb reached over, pulling his youngest close. "But I'm grateful for what she left us. For this map, for the possibility. And I'm grateful you 3 are brave enough to take this journey with me." Lydia listened, watching firelight play across their faces, feeling both deeply included and somehow separate from this moment of family grief. She hadn't known Margaret, couldn't share their memories, existed in their lives as both necessity and intrusion. But she could honor what Margaret had given them, could help them reach the destination a dying woman had worked to preserve. The third day broke cooler, clouds moving in from the west. Lydia woke to find Caleb already up, studying the sky with concern. "Rain coming?" she asked quietly, not wanting to wake the girls yet. "Maybe. Hard to tell in mountain country." He pointed toward the three sisters, now much closer. "But we need to reach that valley soon. Camping in a storm with 3 children and limited supplies is dangerous. How far, do you think?" "If the map's accurate, we're maybe a day away. Day and a half at most." He turned to her, his expression serious. "But the terrain's going to get harder. The map shows a ridge we have to follow, then a descent into the valley. That descent could be tricky." They woke the girls and moved through morning preparations with increased urgency. Breakfast was quick: leftover cornmeal fried in the pan, water, dried apple for energy. They packed everything carefully, double-checking that nothing was left behind. The morning's walk took them through increasingly rough country. The path, if it could even be called a path, wound between boulders and through stands of pine where fallen needles made the ground treacherous. They had to help the girls over obstacles, passing Sarah hand to hand across gaps between rocks, boosting Rose and Emma up steep sections. Around noon, the first raindrops fell, fat and scattered, tentative scouts for the storm building behind them. Caleb increased their pace, pushing now, his earlier caution about rest overridden by the need for shelter. "I'm tired," Sarah whimpered, riding on his back. "Papa, I'm tired." "I know, sweetheart. Keep holding on. We're close now." His voice stayed steady despite the strain Lydia could see in his shoulders, in the way he compensated for the uneven ground. The rain intensified as they climbed the ridge. Margaret's map had marked. Lightning flickered in the distance, thunder following seconds later, close enough to worry about, far enough to keep moving. They reached the ridgeline just as the storm broke in earnest, rain sheeting down in wind-driven walls. "There!" Caleb shouted over the downpour, pointing ahead and down. "The valley!" Lydia squinted through the rain, trying to see what he saw. The ridge dropped away steeply, descending into what might have been a valley, or might have been shadow and wishful thinking. Trees obscured details, rain blurred everything, but the shape was right. A basin between hills, protected, contained. "We have to get down there." Caleb was already moving, finding the start of what might have been an old game trail descending the slope. The descent was terrifying. The trail, if Margaret's father had made it, if it had ever been more than a deer path, was steep and rain-slicked. They had to pick their way carefully, Caleb leading, testing each foothold before committing weight. Lydia came behind, helping the girls, her heart in her throat every time one of them slipped. Emma went down hard about halfway, her feet shooting out from under her on mud-slick stone. She slid 6 feet before catching herself on a pine sapling, her hands raw and bleeding from the impact. "I'm okay," she gasped before anyone could panic. "I'm okay, just scraped." "Hold on to the trees," Lydia directed, trying to project calm despite her own fear. "Move slow, don't worry about speed, just about staying upright." Thunder cracked directly overhead, close enough to feel in their chests. Sarah started crying, her small sobs muffled against Caleb's shoulder. Rose slipped but caught herself, her face white with effort and fear. They were soaked through, cold despite the summer date, when the slope finally began to level out. The trees thinned, and through the rain, Lydia began to see what Caleb had spotted from above. A valley. Not huge, but substantial, maybe a mile across, 2 miles long, cradled between protective hills. And through its center, visible even in the storm, a creek ran dark and swift with rainfall. Trees clustered thick along its banks, their leaves bright green even in the gray light. Meadow grass bent under the rain's assault, and there— "The cabin," Caleb breathed. "Sweet mercy, there's the cabin." It stood on a slight rise near the creek, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray. The roof looked intact, the structure solid despite years of standing empty. Smoke-darkened stone marked where a chimney rose from one end. A covered porch stretched across the front, offering the promise of dry shelter. They ran the last 100 yards, splashing through grass and mud, no longer caring about careful footwork or conserved energy. The porch steps were sound beneath their feet, the door swollen with moisture but functional. Caleb put his shoulder to it, and it opened with a groan of protest, swinging inward to reveal darkness and the smell of long abandonment. But it was dry, and it was shelter, and it was real. They stumbled inside, dripping, exhausted, overwhelmed. Lydia set down her pack with a thud, her shoulders screaming relief at the released weight. The girls collapsed in a heap near the door, too tired to even look around properly. Caleb stood in the center of the single large room, turning slowly, taking inventory. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth deep and well-built. Rough wooden furniture remained, a table, benches, a bed frame built into the wall. Shelves held rusted tins and broken crockery. Gaps in the chinked logs let in threads of gray light, but the roof overhead was solid, the floor mostly sound. "We made it," Rose said, her voice small with wonder and disbelief. "We actually made it." Lydia looked at Caleb, saw tears mixing with rainwater on his face, saw the complex emotion playing across his features, grief that Margaret hadn't lived to see this, relief that her gift had been real, gratitude that they'd survived the journey to claim it. "First things first," she said, forcing herself into practical mode because someone had to be practical. "We get dry, we get warm, then we explore. The fireplace still held old ashes, but the chimney drew properly when Caleb tested it with a handful of dry grass from his pack. They built a careful fire, nursing it with the driest wood they could find, slowly coaxing it into genuine heat. Steam rose from their wet clothes as they stood close, shivering, gradually warming. "There should be a hearthstone," Caleb said suddenly, remembering. Margaret's letter said the deed was hidden beneath the hearthstone. They cleared the ashes carefully, searching the stones that lined the fireplace floor. The third stone from the left, larger and flatter than the others, shifted when Caleb pried at its edges. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly kept out the moisture, lay a tin box. The box opened with a screech of protesting metal. Inside, protected by multiple layers of waxed paper, lay documents, yellowed but legible. A claim certificate filed with the Territorial Land Office, dated 1859. A survey map showing clear boundaries. A deed transferring ownership from Thomas Crawford to Margaret Crawford upon his death in 1863. And a will, simple and direct, leaving all property to Margaret's lawful heirs. "It's legitimate," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's all here, all legal. This land belongs to the girls by right of inheritance. No one can take it from them." Lydia felt something in her chest release, a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. They weren't squatters. They weren't trespassers hoping to claim abandoned property. They were the rightful owners of this valley, this cabin, this possibility. "Mama knew," Emma said quietly, coming to look at the documents her mother had protected. "She knew we'd need this someday." "She knew," Caleb agreed, carefully refolding the papers. "And she made sure it would be here when we did." The rain continued through the afternoon and into evening, but inside the cabin they were dry and relatively warm. Lydia explored their new home while the girls recovered from the journey. The cabin was a single large room with the built-in bed, a loft accessible by a ladder, and surprising attention to detail in its construction. Whoever Margaret's father had been, he'd built for permanence, not temporary shelter. The windows, though small, were positioned to catch morning light and afternoon breezes. The door faced south, away from prevailing winds. The fireplace had a crane for hanging cooking pots and a built-in warming oven. Pegs lined one wall for hanging clothes and tools. A dry sink stood near the door, waiting for a bucket and basin. It needed work. Thorough cleaning, chinking repair, a proper inventory of what remained and what they'd need to make. But it was solid. It was theirs. And outside, beyond the rain-streaked windows, lay a valley that Margaret's letter had promised ran with water year-round. They ate cold food that night, too tired to cook properly, too emotionally exhausted to do more than go through basic motions. The girls climbed into the loft, their voices drifting down as they whispered about the valley, the cabin, what tomorrow might bring. Caleb and Lydia spread their bedrolls near the fire, lying close for warmth and comfort. "I never really believed," Caleb said into the darkness, "even carrying the letter, following the map. I didn't let myself believe it would be real." "And now?" Lydia asked. "Now I'm terrified of what comes next. of whether we can actually make a life here, of whether I brought my family to the middle of nowhere on a dead woman's hope. His voice cracked. Of whether I've made everything worse instead of better. Lydia rolled toward him, finding his hand in the darkness. Tomorrow we'll look around properly, see what's here, what we have to work with. Make a plan. But tonight we rest. We made it, Caleb. 3 days through hard country, a dangerous descent in a storm, 3 children kept safe through all of it. That's not nothing. It's not enough, he said. Not yet. It's just the beginning. Then we begin, Lydia replied simply. We've already proven we can do hard things. We'll prove we can do this too. Outside, the rain continued, washing the valley clean, filling the creek, watering the meadows. And inside the cabin, a family slept their first night in a place that belonged to them, not by charity or tolerance or conditional permission, but by right, by inheritance, by the fierce love of a woman who died making sure her children would have somewhere to turn when the world became too hard. The journey had been brutal, terrifying, uncertain, but they had arrived. And tomorrow they would discover what Margaret Crawford had really left them. Morning arrived with startling clarity, the storm-washed sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Lydia woke to sunlight streaming through the gaps in the cabin's chinked logs, painting bars of gold across the rough plank floor. For a moment she forgot where she was, then remembered everything at once. The valley, the cabin, the end of running, and the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. Caleb was already outside. She could hear his footsteps on the porch, the creak of boards as he moved. The girls still slept in the loft, their breathing soft and even, their bodies finally getting the rest they'd earned through 3 days of hard travel. Lydia rose quietly, finger combing her hair and rebraiding it before stepping out into air so fresh it tasted clean. The valley spread before her in the morning light, and what she saw made her breath catch. The storm had revealed what yesterday's rain had obscured. The creek ran swift and clear, maybe 20 feet wide where it curved past the cabin, its banks thick with willow and wild rose. Beyond the creek, meadow grass stretched green and lush, dotted with late summer wildflowers, purple lupine, yellow prairie clover, white yarrow. The hills that cradled the valley rose in gentle slopes covered with pine and aspen, their leaves trembling silver in the morning breeze. But it was the trees along the far slope that held her attention. Fruit trees. She could see them now in the clear light. Apple, she thought, and possibly plum or cherry. Rows of them, deliberate plantings that had gone wild but still bore the shape of cultivation. Margaret's father had planted an orchard. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch, his hands on the railing, staring at the valley as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. Lydia moved to stand beside him, not speaking, just sharing the moment of discovery. I counted 6 apple trees, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Maybe more hidden in the growth. And look there, past the meadow, near the base of the eastern hill. Lydia followed his pointing finger and saw what he meant. A garden plot, overgrown but still visible as a rectangular clearing different from the surrounding vegetation, and beyond it, what might have been the remains of a fence line. He meant to ranch here, Caleb continued, piecing together the evidence. Build something permanent, the orchard, the garden, the fence lines. This wasn't a temporary claim. This was meant to be a homestead. What stopped him? Lydia asked. Death, probably. Or illness. Or maybe just age and the loneliness of the frontier. Caleb turned to look at the cabin with new appreciation. But he built well, built to last, and Margaret made sure we'd find it. The girls appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from their eyes, drawn by the sound of voices. Sarah came out first, took 3 steps, then stopped dead, her small mouth falling open in wonder. It's beautiful, she breathed. It's the most beautiful place I ever saw. Rose and Emma crowded beside her, and for a long moment, the 5 of them just stood there, taking in what they'd claimed through desperation and faith. The sun warmed their faces. The creek sang its constant song. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, circling on thermals rising from the warming valley floor. Can we explore? Emma asked, her exhaustion from yesterday completely erased by excitement. Can we see everything? After breakfast, Lydia said firmly, already mentally cataloging what they'd need to do. And after we make a plan, We don't just wander into unknown territory without preparation. But she understood their eagerness. The valley called to something fundamental, the human need for beauty, for abundance, for a place that felt like it might actually sustain life rather than just tolerate it. They ate cornmeal mush and the last of the dried apples while Caleb outlined priorities. We need to know what we have to work with: the orchard, the garden plot, any other structures or resources. We need to check the cabin thoroughly. What needs immediate repair? What can wait? We need to inventory our supplies and figure out how long they'll last. And we need water from the creek, Lydia added, to clean properly, to wash clothes, to cook. We've been rationing too long. I want to see the orchard, Rose said. If there's fruit, we should pick it before it falls and rots. Practical thinking, Caleb approved. All right, we work in pairs. Emma and Rose, you're with me. We'll check the orchard and garden, look for any other outbuildings. Lydia and Sarah, you inventory the cabin and get water. We meet back here at midday, share what we found, make decisions from there. They scattered with purpose, and Lydia felt the shift in mood from desperate survival to active building. This was different from the journey, different from the last months in Ridge Creek. This was taking ownership, claiming space, beginning the work of transformation from empty structure to actual home. The cabin revealed itself slowly as she and Sarah cleaned and explored. The built-in bed had a rope frame that needed tightening but was fundamentally sound. The loft was dry, with space enough for the girls to sleep comfortably separated from the adults. The fireplace's crane mechanism still worked, swinging in and out smoothly despite years of disuse. But there were problems, too. Several logs needed rechinking where the clay had crumbled away. The door hung slightly crooked, letting in drafts. One window shutter had rotted through and would need replacement. The floor had gaps that would be cold come winter. "Mama Lydia, look!" Sarah called from near the dry sink. She'd found a wooden box tucked on a shelf, and inside it lay treasures. A set of tin measuring cups, a few unbroken plates, a small mirror in a carved frame, candle stubs wrapped in paper. "Good find," Lydia praised, examining the items. "These are things we needed and didn't have." They carried water from the creek in the cooking pot, making multiple trips until they had enough for a thorough cleaning. Lydia swept the floor with a makeshift broom of bound grass, then scrubbed it with creek water and river sand. Sarah helped wipe down the shelves, her small hands reaching into corners Lydia couldn't access easily. By the time Caleb and the older girls returned, the cabin smelled of fresh air and damp wood instead of abandonment and dust. Sunlight slanted through clean windows, illuminating space that was beginning to look inhabited rather than haunted. "The orchard," Emma announced breathlessly as they burst through the door, "has apples, lots of them, and Papa says there's plums too, though those are mostly done for the season." "Enough to eat fresh and preserve for winter," Caleb added, setting down a basket they'd improvised from his shirt. The fabric bulged with fruit, small apples, misshapen from years without pruning but perfectly edible. "The trees need work, but they're producing. That's food we won't have to buy or trade for." Rose carried wildflowers she'd picked from the meadow, their bright colors a stark contrast to the cabin's muted tones. "Can we put these in water? Make it pretty?" "We can," Lydia agreed, finding a tin cup that would serve as a vase. "Beauty matters too, not just practicality." They ate apples for lunch, the tart sweetness exploding across tongues grown accustomed to bland trail food. Juice ran down Sarah's chin, and she laughed, actually laughed, the sound so unexpected and precious that everyone stopped to listen. "What did you find in the garden?" Lydia asked when they had all caught their breath from the simple joy of fresh fruit. "Tomatoes gone wild," Caleb reported. "Overgrown but still producing. Some kind of squash, though I'm not sure what variety. And what might be potato plants, but we'd have to dig to know for sure." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And I found something else, past the garden, up against the eastern hill. There's a depression in the rock, and water seeps from it. Not much, but constant. And the rock around it has a strange color, sort of silver gray with dark streaks." Lydia saw something shift in his expression, a carefully controlled excitement he was trying not to show in front of the girls. "Should we look at it together?" she asked carefully, "after we settle the girls with a task." His eyes met hers, confirming what she'd suspected. He'd found something significant and didn't want to discuss it until they could evaluate it privately. They sent the girls to pick wildflowers for drying, Rose explaining that dried flowers could brighten the cabin through winter, Emma organizing the expedition with characteristic seriousness, Sarah just happy to be included. When their voices had faded into the meadow, Caleb led Lydia toward the eastern hill. The garden plot was exactly as he'd described, overgrown but clearly defined, plants that had once been carefully tended now fighting for space with weeds and volunteer growth. But past it, where the meadow gave way to rocky slope, she saw what had caught his attention. Water seeped from a crack in the exposed rock face, trickling down to form a small pool before overflowing into the meadow. The rock around the seep showed distinct coloring, dark gray stone shot through with lighter veins that caught the sunlight with subtle metallic sheen. "Silver," Caleb said quietly. "I think it's silver. Not a rich vein, not enough to draw attention or cause a rush, but enough that if we're careful, if we're smart about it, we could extract small amounts for trade." Lydia's heart rate accelerated. Silver meant money, meant resources, meant the ability to buy tools and supplies without depending on charity or credit. But it also meant danger if the wrong people learned about it, meant potential conflict, meant everything they'd escaped from Ridge Creek could follow them here. "Who else knows?" she asked. Margaret's father, obviously. Margaret probably, though she never mentioned it in the letter. Caleb ran his hand over the rock face, tracing the veins. "But it's not marked on the claim documents, not registered anywhere official, just here, waiting." "We don't tell anyone," Lydia said firmly. "We work it ourselves, sparingly. Small amounts extracted carefully, traded at different towns, so no one connects us to a source. We use it to buy what we need to make this valley self-sufficient, then we stop." Agreed. Caleb looked relieved that she understood the delicate balance required. The land can provide almost everything: food, water, shelter, but there are things we'll need from outside. Tools we can't make. Glass for windows. Medicine. The silver gives us the means to get those things without debt or dependence. They stood together, looking at the seep that represented both opportunity and risk. Around them, the valley went about its business, the creek flowing, the grass growing, the aspens whispering their silver-green secrets to the wind. A place of abundance, if they were wise enough to receive it without destroying it. "We tell the girls it's just water," Lydia said. "Nothing special, just another resource the valley provides." "They're young," Caleb agreed. "They don't need to carry this knowledge yet. Let them just be children for a while longer." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, united in their secret stewardship, and found the girls had returned with armloads of flowers and grass for weaving. The afternoon passed in domestic contentment, hanging flowers to dry, organizing the cabin's meager contents, planning improvements and repairs. But that night, after the girls had climbed to the loft and their breathing had evened into sleep, Caleb and Lydia sat by the fire making real plans. "The cabin needs chinking before cold weather," Caleb said, keeping his voice low. "And I should cut firewood, let it season. Winter in mountain country is serious, and we can't be caught unprepared." "We need to preserve everything we can from the orchard and garden," Lydia added. "I can dry apples, make preserves if we can get sugar. The tomatoes and squash we should process and store." "Which means trips to town for supplies." Caleb poked at the fire, his expression troubled. "Which means deciding which town, how often, how to explain ourselves if anyone asks." "We're homesteaders," Lydia said simply. "Working a family claim. That's all anyone needs to know. We don't mention Ridge Creek, don't reference where we came from. We're just another family trying to make a go of it on the frontier. The nearest settlement is probably 3 days' ride," Caleb calculated. "Too far for regular trips. We'll need to plan carefully, buy in bulk, make each journey count." They talked through logistics until the fire burned low, what they needed immediately versus what could wait, how to maximize their limited resources, when to make the first trading trip. The silver changed everything. Instead of being trapped by poverty, they had a hidden resource that could buy them independence if used carefully. The next days fell into patterns dictated by necessity and the valley's rhythm. Caleb worked on repairs, harvesting pine logs for rechinking, cutting firewood, reinforcing the porch. The girls helped where they could, learning to gather clay from the creek bank, mix it with grass for chinking, pack it carefully into gaps between logs. Lydia established a kitchen routine, using the cabin's resources to create order from chaos. She inventoried their remaining supplies: flour running low, beans adequate for another week, salt pork nearly gone. She picked wild greens from the meadow, identifying edible plants she'd learned about from her mother. She boiled water for drinking, washed clothes in the creek, hung them to dry on branches behind the cabin. And slowly, incrementally, the cabin transformed from shelter into home. Rose's dried flowers hung from the rafters, adding color and gentle fragrance. Emma organized a learning corner in the loft, where she taught her sisters reading and arithmetic using the single book they'd carried and problems she invented. Sarah claimed a spot near the hearth where her rag doll presided over imaginary tea parties. 2 weeks after their arrival, Caleb announced he'd be making the first trading trip. They discussed it privately, decided he'd go alone rather than risk the whole family on roads they didn't know. He'd take several small pieces of silver he'd carefully extracted and worked into tradable form, nothing large enough to draw attention, just enough to buy essentials. "You'll be all right?" he asked Lydia the night before his departure, genuine concern in his voice. "We'll be fine," she assured him, more confident than she felt. "We have the cabin, the creek, the rifle if something threatens. We'll stay close, stay alert. You just focus on getting what we need and coming back safely." He left at dawn, carrying a pack with camping gear and the carefully concealed silver. Lydia watched him disappear into the trees at the valley's northern edge, then turned back to find 3 worried faces. "Papa will come back, right?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "He'll come back," Lydia promised. "Your father has never broken a promise to you, and he's not starting now. He said he'd be gone 5 days, maybe 6. We count the days, and we trust him." They filled the time with work that kept hands busy and minds occupied. Lydia showed the girls how to harvest and dry herbs for winter medicine. They picked apples from the trees they could reach safely, laying them out to store in the cabin's coolest corner. They washed clothes thoroughly, scrubbing out the trail dust that had become embedded in every fabric fiber. And they talked. With Caleb gone, something shifted in the dynamic, and the girls began asking questions they'd held back before. "Do you miss your old life?" Emma asked on the 3rd day, as they sat shelling beans Lydia had found growing wild at the meadow's edge. "Before you married Papa, when you could have married someone rich?" Lydia considered the question seriously, giving it the respect it deserved. "I miss some people, a few friends who were kind to me. But the life itself? No. I was a woman with no family and limited prospects, working in a boarding house and watching the years pass. The town thought I should be grateful for any offer, even a poor one, but I chose your father because I saw something they couldn't see." "What?" Rose asked, genuinely curious. "Integrity," Lydia said simply. "The kind of goodness that doesn't depend on circumstances. Your father was poor, yes, but he was never small. He didn't blame the world for his hardships. He didn't let bitterness make him cruel. He just kept trying, kept working, kept taking care of you girls with everything he had." "Mama said he was the best man she ever knew," Emma said quietly. "She said we should always remember that, even when times got hard." "Your mama was right." Lydia reached over, squeezing the girl's hand. "And she loved you all enough to give you an escape route when she knew she couldn't be here to protect you herself. That letter, this valley, that was her final gift, her way of making sure you'd have somewhere to turn." "Do you think she'd like you?" Sarah asked with a child's blunt directness. "If she could meet you?" Lydia felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I hope so. I hope she'd see that I'm trying to take care of her family, that I love you girls like you're my own, that I'm doing my best to honor what she built and what she left behind." "She would," Emma said with surprising certainty, "because you're here. You came with us even though it was hard. You didn't have to, but you did. That's what Mama would care about, that you chose us." The conversation stayed with Lydia through the evening and into the next day. She'd married Caleb thinking she understood what she was choosing: partnership, purpose, escape from a limited future. But she hadn't fully grasped how completely she'd be woven into a family story that started before she arrived and would continue after. Margaret's presence lived in this valley, in her daughter's memories, in the cabin her father had built, and the letter she'd written. Lydia wasn't replacing her. She was continuing what Margaret had started, stewarding what Margaret had protected. On the fifth evening, as sunset painted the valley in shades of amber and rose, Caleb returned. They heard the horse before they saw it. He'd traded for a sturdy mare with supplies tied to a makeshift pack saddle. The girls ran to meet him, and he dismounted to embrace them, his face creased with exhaustion and relief. "Successful?" Lydia asked when the initial excitement had settled. "Very." He began unloading, and Lydia's eyes widened at the array of supplies. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, cornmeal, a saw, a hammer, precious nails, glass for window panes, seeds for spring planting, fabric for winter clothes, a large cooking pot to supplement their single pan. "How?" she asked quietly, knowing the silver he'd carried couldn't have purchased all this. "The silver bought the essentials," he explained, keeping his voice low so the girls wouldn't hear details. "But I also traded labor. There's a ranch 2 days north, decent people who needed help with harvest. I worked 3 days, they paid fair, and the rancher's wife sent these." He pulled out a wrapped bundle, quilting fabric scraps, a spool of good thread, needles. "You worked?" Lydia felt simultaneous gratitude and guilt. "You should have rested." "I worked and I listened," Caleb corrected. "Learned about the area, about markets, about who's trustworthy and who's not. The rancher, Jenkins is his name, he's straight dealing. Said if we need work in future, he'd hire me seasonal. No questions about where we came from, just interested in whether I'd show up and work hard." That night, after supper made from fresh supplies and the luxury of real coffee, Caleb shared what else he'd learned. The nearest town was called Timber Ridge, a lumber settlement with a general store, a church, a school. The rancher had mentioned that families in the high valleys were scattered but connected through occasional gatherings and mutual aid when needed. "We're not as isolated as I feared," he said, relief evident in his voice. "There's a community here, loose and spread out, but real. People who mind their own business but help neighbors when times are hard. That's all we need." "Did you mention the valley?" Lydia asked. "Only that we're homesteading family land south of the Three Sisters. No details about location, resources, nothing specific." He met her eyes. "The silver stays our secret, but we can be part of this larger community without giving up our privacy." Over the following weeks, life in the valley took on a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. The weather held clear and warm, summer extending itself generously into early autumn. They worked from dawn until dusk, harvesting, preserving, preparing for winter. Caleb finished re-chinking the cabin and cut enough firewood to fill a shed he'd built behind the main structure. Lydia dried apples and made preserves from wild plums, storing them in jars she'd gotten through trade. The girls thrived in ways that broke Lydia's heart with their simple beauty. They grew tan and strong from outdoor work, their earlier pallor and thinness replaced by healthy color and developing muscle. They laughed more, played more, fought less. The valley's abundance had lifted the low-grade anxiety that came from never having quite enough. One afternoon, Emma came running from the orchard with news. "Mama Lydia, there's a treehouse in the big apple tree, an actual platform with a ladder." They all went to see, and sure enough, built into the largest apple tree's branches, a platform remained from some earlier time. It needed repairs, but the basic structure was sound. "Your grandfather must have built it," Caleb said, examining the construction. "Built it for your mother, maybe, when she was young?" The girls' faces lit with wonder at the connection to their history. "Can we fix it?" Rose asked. "Can we make it usable again?" "We can," Caleb agreed. "Carefully, so it's safe. But yes, we can restore it." They spent days on the project, Caleb reinforcing the platform while the girls handed him tools and materials. When finished, the treehouse became their special place, a retreat for reading, for talking, for looking out over the valley their great-grandfather had claimed and their mother had protected. Lydia watched them up there one evening, their silhouettes dark against the sunset sky, their voices carrying down in fragments of conversation and laughter. This was what Margaret had wanted, she realized. Not just survival, but joy. Not just escape from hardship, but space for childhood, for growth, for becoming who they were meant to be. As September deepened into October and the aspen leaves turned gold against the evergreen pines, Lydia found herself standing by the creek one morning, watching the water flow clear and constant. Behind her, the cabin stood solid, smoke rising from its chimney. Around her the valley spread in protected abundance: meadow, orchard, hillside, sky. They had found what Margaret's letter had promised: water year-round, shelter ready for inhabiting, land that could sustain them if they were wise and worked hard. But they'd also found something the letter hadn't specified, couldn't have guaranteed: possibility. The chance to build lives defined by their choices rather than their circumstances. The freedom to fail or succeed based on their own efforts rather than someone else's judgment. Caleb appeared beside her, his hand finding hers naturally. Thinking? Grateful, she said simply, for this place, for that letter, for Margaret's foresight and her father's work, and the pure luck that brought us here when we needed it most. Not luck, Caleb said quietly. Providence. Preparation meeting, desperation, at exactly the right moment. They stood together as the morning light strengthened, painting the valley in shades of gold and green, an endless possibility. The hardest work still lay ahead: surviving winter, building true self-sufficiency, making this valley into a permanent home rather than temporary refuge. But they'd already proven they could do hard things. They'd walked away from everything familiar into unknown country on the strength of a dead woman's directions. They'd kept 3 children safe through difficult travel and dangerous descent. They'd taken an abandoned cabin and made it shelter, taken neglected land and begun making it productive. The valley had given them what they needed most: not wealth or ease, but the chance to determine their own story. And that, Lydia understood with sudden clarity, was worth every step of the journey that had brought them here. Winter announced itself gradually, politely almost, giving them time to prepare. The aspen leaves that had blazed gold through October turned brown and fell, carpeting the valley floor in rustling drifts. Morning frost lingered longer each day, painting the meadowgrass white until the sun climbed high enough to melt it. The creek's voice changed, its summer enthusiasm quieting to a steadier, deeper tone. Lydia stood at the cabin window one November morning, watching her breath fog the glass Caleb had carefully installed. Outside, the girls were helping their father stack the last of the firewood against the cabin's north wall, their voices carrying clear in the cold air. They'd grown so much in the 3 months since arrival. Emma had shot up 2 inches, her dresses suddenly too short. Rose had lost the last of her baby roundness, her face taking on the angular beauty that would define her in adulthood. Even Sarah had changed, her vocabulary expanding daily, her confidence blooming in the valley's safety. "That's the last of it," Caleb announced, stamping snow from his boots as he entered. The first real snow had fallen 2 days ago, just 3 inches that melted quickly. But it had been a warning. Heavier weather was coming. "We're ready," Lydia said with more confidence than she felt. The cabin was tight and warm, their food stores adequate if carefully managed. But winter in mountain country was notoriously unpredictable, and they were learning its patterns for the first time. "Ready as we can be," Caleb agreed, understanding her unspoken concern. "But I should make one more trip to Jenkins' ranch before the heavy snows come. See if he needs help, trade some of our preserves for things we might have forgotten." "When?" Lydia asked, already calculating how long he'd be gone. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds. I'll take the mare, travel light, be back in 5 days." He moved to the fire, warming his hands. "You'll be all right here?" "We managed last time." But Lydia remembered those days of waiting, the low-grade anxiety that came from being responsible for 3 children in isolated country. "Though I'll be glad when you're back." He left at dawn the next morning, and Lydia watched him ride north until the trees swallowed him. Then she turned back to the cabin and the work that would fill the days until his return. The girls had lessons to continue. Emma was reading at a level that surprised Lydia. Rose showed natural aptitude for numbers. Sarah was learning her letters with fierce determination. There was spinning to do with the drop spindle Lydia had traded for, turning wool from their few sheep into thread for winter knitting. There were clothes to mend, always clothes to mend with growing children and hard use. But on the second day of Caleb's absence, the weather turned. Lydia woke to silence, the particular muffled quiet that meant heavy snow. She rose carefully, not wanting to wake the girls, and moved to the window. What she saw made her stomach tighten with worry. Snow fell thick and fast, already ankle-deep in the meadow and still coming. The wind had picked up, driving the flakes sideways, obscuring the far hills completely. This wasn't the polite warning snow from 2 days ago. This was the real thing. Winter arriving with force and intention. Mama Lydia? Emma appeared beside her, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Is Papa going to be all right? Lydia chose truth over false comfort. Your father is smart and experienced. If he saw the storm coming, he'd have stayed at the ranch. If he was already traveling, he'd have found shelter. Either way, he won't risk traveling in this. But that means he won't come home when he planned, Emma said, working through the logic with her characteristic seriousness. It means we might have to wait longer than 5 days, Lydia agreed, which means we stay calm, stay warm, and trust him to make good decisions. The snow continued through that day and into the night, piling up against the cabin walls, drifting deep in places where the wind caught it. Lydia kept the fire burning steadily, rationing wood but keeping the temperature livable. The girls helped without complaint, understanding that this was serious weather requiring serious attention. On the third morning, the snow stopped. Lydia opened the door to find the world transformed, white and pristine and beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. The snow reached past her knees in the meadow, deeper where it had drifted. The creek still ran, its dark water a sharp contrast to the surrounding white, but ice had begun forming at its edges. Can we go out? Rose asked, enchanted by the transformed landscape. Bundled warm and staying close, Lydia agreed. We need to check on the animals, make sure the woodshed is accessible, and dig out the path to the creek. They had acquired 2 sheep and 3 chickens through Caleb's trading, animals that provided wool, eggs, and the promise of future increase. The small shed Caleb had built for them stood behind the cabin, and Lydia was relieved to find the animals healthy, if cold. The girls helped scatter feed and break ice from the water bucket, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The physical work helped manage the anxiety of waiting. Each task completed was one less thing to worry about, one more sign of their capability to handle whatever came. They hauled water, chopped ice from the path, checked and rechecked their food stores. And through it all, Lydia projected calm competence while her mind calculated and worried. Caleb had said 5 days. It was now day 4, and the snow had made travel impossible. Even if he started back tomorrow, the deep snow would slow him significantly. It could be a week, maybe more, before he returned. And meanwhile, they were alone in a mountain valley with winter settling in for its long stay. That night, after the girls had climbed to the loft, Lydia sat by the fire trying to keep fear at bay. She'd never been solely responsible for children before, had never had to make decisions that could mean the difference between comfort and hardship, safety and danger. Caleb's presence had been a steady anchor, his experience and judgment something she'd relied on without fully acknowledging it. But sitting alone in the firelight, she understood something new. She was capable. She'd kept the household running during his trading trips. She'd managed resources, maintained the cabin, taught the girls, and made a dozen small decisions daily that kept life functioning smoothly. Fear didn't equal incapability. It just meant she understood the stakes. Morning brought clear skies and brutal cold. Lydia woke to find frost had formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire burning all night. She built up the blaze before waking the girls, wanting the cabin warm before they emerged from their blankets. How cold is it? Emma asked, watching her breath cloud in the air. Very, Lydia answered honestly. But we have fire, food, and shelter. That's what matters. They spent that day close to home, venturing out only for necessary chores. Lydia taught the girls a card game using a worn deck she'd found in the cabin's storage, their laughter filling the space where worry tried to take root. They baked bread together, the process warming the cabin and providing the comfort of familiar routine. On the 6th day, Emma spotted movement on the northern trail. Someone's coming! They all rushed to the window, and Lydia's heart leaped with relief. Caleb was leading the mare carefully through the snow, both of them moving slowly but steadily. He looked exhausted, frost clinging to his beard and eyebrows, but whole and safe. The girls ran out to meet him, heedless of the cold, and Lydia followed more slowly, giving them their moment of reunion. When Caleb's eyes met hers over the children's heads, she saw her own relief reflected back, gratitude for safety, for home, for family intact despite weather's challenge. Stayed at the ranch, he explained later when the girls were occupied with the treats he'd brought them, peppermint sticks from Jenkins' wife. Saw the storm coming and Jenkins insisted. Smart decision, but hard, knowing you were here managing alone. We managed fine, Lydia said, and meant it. Worried, yes, but we kept warm, kept busy, kept the place running. I never doubted, Caleb said softly, but I'm grateful to be home. The word settled between them with new weight. Home. Not the cabin, not the valley, but the whole complicated, beautiful thing they were building together. Partnership and family and belonging all wrapped into one fragile, essential structure. The storm had been a test, and they'd passed it. But winter was just beginning, and the valley had more lessons to teach. December brought cold that seemed to have physical presence, pressing against the cabin walls, seeking entry through every gap and crack. The girls woke some mornings to find their breath had frozen in the air overnight, tiny ice crystals suspended above their sleeping forms. The creek froze solid except for a narrow channel in the center where the current ran too fast for ice to form completely. But the cabin held. Caleb's careful chinking kept out the worst of the wind. The fireplace, built by someone who understood mountain winters, radiated heat efficiently, and the family's routines provided structure against the shapeless days when snow kept them inside. Lydia established a rhythm that carried them through the short, dark days. Mornings were for lessons, reading, writing, arithmetic for the older girls, letters and numbers for Sarah. Afternoons brought practical work, spinning, knitting, mending, cooking. Evenings belonged to stories, either read from their few books or told from memory, tales that carried them beyond the cabin's walls into worlds of adventure and possibility. Tell us about the ocean, Rose requested one evening when the wind howled outside and made the lamplight flicker. Lydia had never seen the ocean, but she'd read about it, imagined it, and she spun that imagining into narrative. Waves like moving mountains, salt spray and seabirds, ships with sails like clouds. The girls listened with wide eyes, their worlds expanding even as the cabin's walls pressed close. Caleb contributed his own stories, tales from his youth, his early years with Margaret, adventures and mishaps that made the girls laugh and sometimes cry. He was giving them their history, Lydia realized, helping them understand where they came from so they could better understand where they were going. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling soft and steady outside, they made their own celebration. Lydia had saved sugar and butter for cookies, and the cabin filled with the smell of baking. Caleb carved small toys from pine scraps, a horse for Sarah, a bird for Rose, a star for Emma to hang above her sleeping spot. They sang carols, Lydia taught them, their voices small but earnest against the winter dark. "This is the best Christmas ever," Sarah declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. And looking around at the simple cabin, the modest gifts, the family gathered close against the cold, Lydia thought the child might be right. They had so little by the world's measure, no fine house, no abundance of presents, no grand celebration. But they had each other, had safety, had the profound comfort of belonging. That was wealth of a different kind, harder to quantify, but no less real. January tested them harder. A series of storms rolled through, each one building on the last, until the snow stood waist-deep in the meadow, and the world beyond the cabin became theoretical rather than actual. They were completely isolated, cut off from any possibility of outside help or contact. The isolation bred a dangerous kind of closeness. Small irritations magnified in the confined space. Rose and Emma bickered over trivial things. Sarah grew whiny and demanding. Even Caleb and Lydia, usually patient with each other, found themselves snapping over nothing. How to stack wood, whether to use more lamp oil, whose turn it was to cook. "We need space," Lydia said one morning after a particularly tense breakfast. "Even if it's just an hour, we need to separate." They instituted a new routine. Each person got an hour alone daily, the loft for whoever claimed it first, the adults taking turns walking to the shed and back, just for the illusion of solitude. It helped. The small break from constant togetherness eased the pressure, let them return to each other with renewed patience. But the real breakthrough came in late January, during what felt like the 100th consecutive day of being snowed in. Emma, frustrated with a knitting project that refused to cooperate, threw it across the cabin with a cry of rage. "I hate it here. I hate being trapped. I hate winter, and I hate this stupid cabin, and I hate everything." Silence fell, heavy and shocked. The girls never complained, never expressed dissatisfaction with their situation. Emma's outburst shattered the careful pretense that everything was fine, that they were all managing beautifully. Lydia expected Caleb to reprimand the girl, to insist on gratitude and proper behavior. Instead, he set down the harness he was mending and looked at his daughter with complete understanding. "You're allowed to hate it sometimes," he said quietly. "You're allowed to be angry that we're trapped here, that you can't run outside whenever you want, that the days are all the same. Feeling that doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you human." Emma stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "But we're supposed to be happy here. This place saved us. We're supposed to be grateful." "Grateful and frustrated aren't opposites," Caleb said. "You can appreciate what this valley gives us and still hate being stuck inside for weeks. Both things are true at the same time." Rose spoke up then, her voice small. "I get angry too sometimes. At Mama, for dying and leaving us. I know it wasn't her fault, but I still get angry." "Me too," Sarah added. "I get angry at the town people for being mean. And sometimes I get angry at Mama Lydia for not being Mama, even though I love Mama Lydia, and it's not fair to be angry about that." Lydia felt her throat tighten with emotion. These children had been so good, so uncomplaining through everything: poverty, loss, upheaval, hard travel, isolation. They'd carried burdens no children should have to carry, and they'd done it with grace and courage. But underneath that grace had been all these normal human emotions they'd thought they weren't allowed to feel. "We're all carrying hard things," Lydia said carefully. "And pretending we're not doesn't make them lighter. Maybe we should talk about them more. Maybe that's how we help each other carry the weight." That night, after supper, they sat around the fire and spoke truth. Emma talked about missing friends from Ridge Creek, despite everything. Rose admitted she sometimes forgot what their mother looked like and felt guilty about it. Sarah confessed she was sometimes scared the cabin would blow away in the wind. Caleb spoke about his fear of failing them, of making wrong decisions that would hurt his family. Lydia shared her anxiety about filling Margaret's shoes, about being enough for children who'd lost their real mother. And something shifted. The cabin felt larger somehow, as if honesty had created space where pretense had been cramping them. They were still isolated, still snowbound, still facing the same daily challenges, but they were facing them together, with truth instead of careful performance. February brought a subtle change in the light, the days stretching incrementally longer. The storms continued, but between them came clear days when the sun on snow was blindingly bright, and the cold had a different quality, still harsh, but no longer quite so absolute. On one such clear day, Caleb decided to check the silver seep. He'd extracted small amounts before winter set in, but hadn't visited the site in months. Lydia went with him, leaving the girls with strict instructions to stay inside and tend the fire. They broke trail through waist-deep snow, exhausting work that left them both breathing hard. The eastern hill looked different under winter's weight, the rocks obscured, the familiar landmarks transformed. But they found the seep, water still trickling despite the cold, freezing into fantastic shapes where it met the air. The silver vein showed more clearly in winter's stripped-down landscape. What had been subtle in summer's growth stood out against snow and bare rock. Caleb examined it carefully, then looked at Lydia with concern. "It's more visible than I thought. Come spring, if anyone came up here, they might notice." "Then we make sure no one has reason to come up here," Lydia said firmly. "This is our land, properly claimed and documented. We're not doing anything wrong, but we also don't need to advertise what we have." They worked together, carefully extracting several small pieces, covering their tracks as they went. The silver would buy seeds for spring planting, perhaps a milk cow if they could find one at a reasonable price, maybe glass for another window. Small improvements that would make the valley more self-sufficient, reducing their need for outside resources and contact. Walking back, Lydia felt the shift in her own thinking. The valley had become truly home, not just shelter or refuge, but the place she wanted to be, to build a life, to raise these children to adulthood. Ridge Creek and the judgment-filled world it represented seemed impossibly distant now, almost fictional. This was real, snow and cold and isolation and the profound satisfaction of surviving through their own effort and planning. March arrived with a late storm that dumped 2 feet of new snow just when they thought winter might be easing. But this storm felt different, more like a final statement than an ongoing threat. And after it cleared, the sun carried genuine warmth. Snow began melting during the day, refreezing at night, creating a crystalline landscape that sparkled and dripped. The girls begged to go outside properly, not just for chores, but for play. Caleb and Lydia looked at each other, silently negotiating, then nodded permission. Within minutes, the cabin echoed with laughter as the girls threw snowballs, built a lopsided snowman, and simply ran for the joy of movement in space. Watching from the porch, Lydia felt Caleb's arms settle around her shoulders. "We made it," he said quietly. "Through the whole winter, we actually made it." "Did you doubt?" she asked. "Sometimes. Late at night, when the wind was screaming and the cold seemed to seep through everything, I'd lie awake wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, if we should have stayed in Ridge Creek and taken our chances with charity and judgment." He paused. "But then morning would come and I'd see you managing everything so competently, see the girls learning and growing, and I'd know we'd made the right choice." "They're going to be fine," Lydia said, watching Emma boost Sarah up to place a stick arm on the snowman. "Better than fine. They're going to be strong and capable and free from the kind of limitations that town would have put on them." "Because of you," Caleb said. "Because you chose us when you could have chosen easier." "I chose possibility," Lydia corrected. "And I got family. That's a fair trade." April arrived decisively, winter breaking like a fever. The snow melted in earnest, the creek swelling with runoff, the meadow appearing in patches of brown grass that would soon green up. Birds returned, their songs filling mornings with sound that seemed impossibly loud after winter's muffled quiet. And with the thaw came the realization of just how much work waited. The garden needed to be cleared, turned, and planted. The orchard required pruning and care. Fences needed repair. The cabin needed a thorough cleaning after months of closed-up living. But they attacked the work with energy born of restlessness and relief. Winter's enforced stillness had built up a reserve of motion that needed release. They worked from dawn to dusk, all 5 of them, transforming the valley from winter dormancy to spring preparation. Caleb made the first post-winter trip to Jenkins' ranch, returning with seeds and news. "Jenkins says there's to be a gathering in Timber Ridge next month. All the scattered families come together, share news, trade goods, let the children play together. He strongly suggested we attend." Lydia felt immediate resistance. They'd been so carefully isolated, so protected in their valley. Going to a gathering meant exposure, meant questions, meant the possibility of someone recognizing them from Ridge Creek or hearing something that would threaten their peace. But Emma, listening from across the cabin, spoke up before Lydia could voice her concerns. "Could we go, Papa? Could we meet other children?" The longing in her voice was unmistakable. The girls had been content with each other's company through winter, but they were still children who needed peer interaction, needed to see themselves reflected in others their age. "We'll think about it," Caleb said carefully. "It's a long trip, and we'd need to plan." That night, he and Lydia discussed it seriously. The risks were real: exposure, questions, the chance of someone making connections they'd rather keep buried. But so were the benefits: community, resources, the girls' social development. "We can't hide forever," Lydia said finally. "And we're not doing anything wrong. We're homesteading legally claimed land, raising a family, building a life. If people ask questions, we answer honestly but vaguely. We're from back east seeking opportunity in the territories. That's true enough?" "You're sure?" Caleb asked. "No," Lydia admitted. "But I think it's necessary. For the girls. If not for us." So they decided to go. To risk connection for the possibility of community. And with that decision, something shifted again. They were no longer just hiding in the valley, just surviving in isolation. They were beginning to build a life that extended beyond their immediate family, that acknowledged their need for human connection even while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The valley had given them space to heal, to rest, to recover from the wounds Ridge Creek had inflicted. But healing was never the end goal. It was preparation for living. Full, engaged, connected living. And that meant eventually opening their carefully protected world just enough to let others in. Spring deepened, the meadow greening up, wildflowers beginning to show color. The garden plot received its first planting, seeds that would, with luck and work, become the food that would carry them through next winter. The orchard burst into bloom, filling the valley with the scent of apple and plum blossoms. And in the midst of all this growth and preparation, Lydia found herself standing by the creek one evening, watching the water run clear and purposeful toward some distant destination. Behind her, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Inside, Caleb was teaching the girls a song his mother had taught him. Their voices carried on the spring air, imperfect but joyful, the sound of family being family. They had survived winter. They had proven the valley could sustain them through the hardest season. And now, as spring offered its gifts of renewal and growth, they were ready to do more than just survive. They were ready to truly live. The gathering in Timber Ridge was set for the first Saturday in May, when the roads would be passable and the weather reliable enough for families to travel safely. As the date approached, Lydia found herself oscillating between anticipation and dread, imagining a dozen scenarios ranging from warm welcome to exposure and judgment. "We need to decide what we're bringing to trade," Caleb said one evening, pulling her from anxious speculation into practical planning. Jenkins said families bring what they have surplus: preserves, crafts, produce. It's part of how the gathering works. Lydia mentally inventoried their resources. They had dried apples from last fall's harvest, several jars of plum preserves, wool yarn she'd spun through the winter months. Nothing remarkable, but honest goods that represented their work and the valley's abundance. "I could bring the yarn," she offered, "and maybe a dozen jars of preserves. We have enough for ourselves and some to spare." The girls were beside themselves with excitement as the day approached. Emma had carefully mended her best dress, Rose had practiced the songs she wanted to share with other children, and Sarah had appointed her rag doll as official traveling companion. Their enthusiasm was contagious enough that Lydia felt her own resistance beginning to soften. They left before dawn on Friday, planning to camp one night on the trail and arrive in Timber Ridge by Saturday morning. The mare carried their trade goods and camping supplies while they walked alongside, the girls taking turns riding when they grew tired. The journey that had seemed so difficult last summer now felt almost easy. They were stronger, more experienced, confident in their ability to travel and manage in country that had once seemed hostile. They made camp that evening near a creek that fed into the same watershed as their valley. While Caleb tended the horse and built the fire, Lydia helped the girls wash trail dust from their faces and hands, wanting them to make a good impression when they arrived. "What if the other children don't like us?" Rose asked quietly, voicing the fear Lydia herself had been trying not to acknowledge. "Then you'll know they're not your kind of people," Lydia answered honestly. "But I think you'll find most children are just looking for friends, same as you. Give them a chance, be yourselves, and see what happens." Timber Ridge appeared through the trees around mid-morning, a collection of perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a central square. The lumber mill that gave the town its purpose stood at the eastern edge, its saw blade silent on this Saturday. But the square itself was alive with activity. Wagons and horses lined the edges of the open space. Long tables had been set up, already laden with goods for trade and sale. Children ran between the adults, their shouts and laughter creating a constant background noise. The smell of cooking food, roasted meat, fresh bread, something sweet and spiced, filled the air. Lydia felt her shoulders tighten with old reflexive wariness, but Caleb's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "We belong here," he murmured. "We're homesteaders, same as them. We have every right to be here." Jenkins spotted them almost immediately, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile as he approached. "Brennan, glad you made it. And you brought the whole family, I see." "My wife Lydia," Caleb said, the possessive pride in his voice making something warm bloom in Lydia's chest. "And my daughters Emma, Rose, and Sarah." "Ma'am." Jenkins tipped his hat respectfully to Lydia, then turned his attention to the girls with the practiced ease of someone who genuinely liked children. "My granddaughters are about your ages. They're over by the church, if you'd like to go introduce yourselves. Fair warning, they're wild as deer and twice as fast." The girls looked to Lydia for permission, and she nodded encouragement. They scampered off with the resilience of youth, leaving the adults to navigate the more complex social terrain. "Let me introduce you around," Jenkins offered, already guiding them toward a cluster of adults near the main trading tables. "Folks here are good people, mostly. Mind their business, help when needed. Don't ask too many questions about what came before." Over the next hour, Lydia met more people than she could immediately keep straight. The Hendersons who ranched north of Jenkins, the Carlsons, who ran a small trading post, the Reverend Matthews and his wife, who served the scattered community's spiritual needs, the widow Morrison, who taught the few children whose families could spare them for schooling. Each introduction followed a similar pattern: names, basic information about their homestead location, polite acknowledgement of the challenges of frontier life. No one asked where they'd come from or why they'd chosen to settle in such isolated country. The lack of interrogation was itself a gift, a sign that these people understood privacy as survival strategy rather than suspicious secrecy. Lydia found herself relaxing incrementally as the day progressed. She traded her preserves for seed potatoes with Mrs. Henderson, exchanged yarn for a bolt of sturdy fabric with Mrs. Carlson, and found herself in genuine conversation with Mrs. Matthews about the challenges of educating children without proper resources. "You're teaching them yourself?" Mrs. Matthews asked with interest. "What are you using for materials?" "We have one book of fairy tales and a Bible," Lydia admitted. "I write out lessons on pieces of bark for arithmetic, make up spelling words from things around the cabin. It's not ideal, but they're learning." "Better than nothing, which is what most isolated families manage," Mrs. Matthews said approvingly. "If you'd like, I could lend you some readers and slates. You'd have to make the trip to return them eventually, but it might help." The offer was made casually, without expectation or judgment, and Lydia felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." Meanwhile, Caleb was engaged in conversation with a group of men discussing the challenges of spring planting, water management, and the constant negotiation with weather and wildlife that defined frontier agriculture. Lydia watched him from across the square, noting how he stood straighter here, how his face had lost the tight wariness that had marked him in Ridge Creek. These men treated him as an equal, valued his input, included him without condescension or pity. The girls appeared periodically throughout the day, flushed and happy from play, dragging Lydia to meet their new friends or show her some treasure they'd been given or discovered. Emma had found a girl her own age who also loved reading. Rose had been teaching younger children a clapping game. Sarah had been adopted by a pack of similar-aged children who treated her like a beloved mascot. By late afternoon, when families began preparing for the communal supper that would cap the gathering, Lydia realized something profound had shifted. They weren't outsiders here. They weren't the objects of pity or judgment or speculation. They were simply another family among families, all trying to build lives in difficult country, all understanding that survival sometimes required both independence and community. The supper was a revelation. Long tables laden with dishes each family had contributed, food that reflected the diversity of backgrounds, and the creativity required to cook well with limited resources. Lydia had brought a dried apple cake, sweet with the last of their winter honey, and watched it disappear within minutes. They ate roasted venison and wild turkey, potato salad, and pickled vegetables, cornbread and berry pies. Everything washed down with coffee and cold creek water. As darkness fell, someone produced a fiddle, someone else a harmonica, and music filled the square. Children danced with unselfconscious joy while adults watched and visited, their conversations ranging from practical to philosophical, from serious to hilarious. Emma danced with Jenkins' granddaughter, Rose joined a circle game, Sarah fell asleep on Lydia's lap, sticky-faced and utterly content. "This is good," Caleb said quietly, appearing at Lydia's elbow with a cup of coffee for her. "This is what I hoped we'd find." "Community without intrusion," Lydia agreed, understanding exactly what he meant. Connection without loss of privacy. They left Sunday morning with promises to return for the next gathering in July, with borrowed books and new seed varieties, with the girls chattering about their new friends and already planning what they'd bring to trade next time. The journey home felt shorter somehow, their steps lighter despite full packs. The valley welcomed them back with early summer abundance, the garden showing the first green shoots of planted seeds, the orchard heavy with developing fruit, the meadow thick with grass that would need cutting for winter hay. But more than the physical beauty, Lydia felt the deep rightness of return, the profound comfort of coming back to a place that was unquestionably, completely theirs. Summer unfolded with the particular intensity of mountain country, where the growing season was short and every day of warmth and sun mattered desperately. They worked dawn to dusk, weeding, watering, harvesting early crops, cutting hay, preserving everything they could against the certainty of winter's return. But it was different from last year's frantic establishment. They knew the valley now, understood its rhythms, could anticipate needs and plan accordingly. Caleb had expanded the garden plot, using knowledge gained from conversations with other homesteaders. Lydia had improved her preserving techniques, learning from Mrs. Henderson's expertise. The girls had taken on more responsibility, managing the chickens entirely, helping with harvesting and processing, contributing meaningfully to the family's survival. In late June, Caleb made a decision that surprised Lydia. "I'm going to register the homestead claim officially," he announced one evening. "Go to the land office, file the proper paperwork, make everything completely legal and above board." "But we have the original claim and deed," Lydia said, not understanding the need. "We have documentation from before the territory was fully organized," Caleb explained, "which is legal, but not necessarily recognized by current authorities. If we file under the Homestead Act with proper survey and documentation, no one can ever question our right to be here. We become part of the official record." Lydia understood then. This wasn't about legal necessity. It was about permanence, about claiming not just the land but their place in the larger territorial structure. It was about saying they belonged not just by occupation, but by law, by record, by official recognition. The trip to the land office took a week, and Caleb returned with official documents bearing seals and signatures, mapping their valley with precision and recording it as the Brennan homestead. He also returned with news. "Ridge Creek is dying," he said without preamble. "I stopped there on the way back just to see. Half the businesses are closed. The mine that supported the town played out. People are leaving, looking for opportunity elsewhere." Lydia absorbed this information with complicated feelings. Mrs. Whitmore? The others who were so cruel? Gone. Most of them. The few who remain look desperate, reduced to the poverty they once judged us for. Caleb met her eyes. "I felt pity, not satisfaction. They're learning what we already knew, that circumstance can humble anyone, that judgment is a luxury of temporary comfort." "Did anyone recognize you?" "A few. They asked where I'd ended up, if things had worked out. I told them the truth, that we'd homesteaded in the mountains, that we were doing well. That was all. I didn't mention the valley's location or resources, just that we'd found what we needed." That night, Lydia lay awake thinking about Ridge Creek's decline and the valley's abundance. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. The town that had judged them as failures was itself failing, while they thrived in the place they'd fled to. But there was no satisfaction in their vindication, just the quiet knowledge that they'd been right to leave, right to believe in possibility over acceptance of limitation. July brought the second gathering, and this time they traveled with confidence rather than anxiety. The girls had items they'd made specifically to trade. Emma had learned to weave baskets from willow gathered by the creek. Rose had dried flower arrangements. Sarah had collected unusually pretty stones she was convinced would make excellent trade goods. The reception this time was warmer, marked by recognition rather than cautious welcome. People asked after their homestead, shared their own summer successes and challenges, included them in conversations with the ease of established acquaintance. The girls disappeared immediately with their friends, already picking up relationships exactly where they'd left them. But it was a conversation with Reverend Matthews that stayed with Lydia long after the gathering ended. They were discussing education, and she'd mentioned her frustration with limited resources and her own knowledge gaps. "You're doing remarkable work with those girls," he said seriously. "Emma's reading level is extraordinary for her age and circumstances. Rose's mathematical thinking is sophisticated. Even little Sarah is ahead of where most children are at her age. That's your doing." "I just work with what we have," Lydia deflected, uncomfortable with direct praise. "That's exactly my point," Matthews continued. "You could have decided education was impossible without proper resources, without formal training. Instead, you've created a learning environment that's producing genuinely educated children. That takes dedication and creativity." Riding home that evening, Lydia turned the conversation over in her mind. She'd been so focused on what they lacked that she'd failed to appreciate what they'd achieved. The girls were healthy, happy, learning, growing, developing into capable young women. That was success measured by the only metrics that truly mattered. August brought the first apples, and they spent days harvesting, processing, storing. The girls had grown tall enough to reach branches that had been beyond their grasp last year, and they competed to see who could pick the most without bruising. The orchard yielded more than they could possibly use, so they dried apples by the bushel, stored perfect ones in the root cellar Caleb had dug, and set aside the best for trading. September arrived with the first hints of autumn, leaves beginning to turn, mornings carrying a sharp edge of cold, geese flying south in ragged V formations. But this year, they were ready. The root cellar was full, the woodshed was stocked, the cabin was tight and weatherproof. They'd learned winter's lessons and prepared accordingly. One evening in late September, as they sat around the table after supper, Emma spoke up with unusual formality. "Papa, Mama Lydia, Rose and I have been talking, and we have something to ask." Lydia and Caleb exchanged glances, recognizing the tone of serious request. "We want to invite the Morrison children to come stay with us this winter," Emma continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Mrs. Morrison teaches school, but the children whose families live far away can't come because the travel's too dangerous in winter. But if some of them came here, we could all learn together, and Mrs. Morrison could visit when weather allowed, and we'd have friends through the winter instead of just each other." The idea was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. Opening their carefully protected valley to others, even children, meant exposure, meant questions, meant potential discovery of resources they'd kept secret. But it also meant community for the girls, meant better education, meant participating in the kind of mutual aid that defined successful frontier life. "How many children?" Caleb asked carefully. "2, maybe 3, Emma said. "The Carlson girl and the Henderson boys. Their families want them educated, but can't spare the time to teach them properly and can't risk winter travel to the widow's school." "That's a significant commitment," Lydia said slowly, her mind already calculating logistics. More mouths to feed, more bodies to keep warm, more children to educate and supervise. "But we have enough," Rose argued. "We have space in the loft. We have food stored, and Mrs. Morrison said she'd pay for their board and supplies and teaching materials if someone could host them." Lydia looked at Caleb, saw her own uncertainty reflected in his expression. This was a threshold they'd be crossing, a fundamental change in how they inhabited the valley. But it was also an opportunity for the girls, for connection, for becoming part of the community in a deeper way. "We need to discuss this privately," Caleb said finally, "but we'll give you an answer by tomorrow." That night, they debated the proposition from every angle. The risks were real. More people meant more exposure, more chance of someone discovering the silver, more complexity in managing daily life. But the benefits were equally real: better education for the girls, meaningful contribution to the community, the kind of involvement that would cement their place in the territorial social structure. "We can't hide forever," Lydia said, echoing her words from spring. "And we're not doing anything wrong. The silver is ours to use as we see fit. Having a few children stay the winter doesn't threaten that." "It changes everything, though," Caleb said. "Changes our privacy, our routines, our control over our own space." "Maybe that's necessary," Lydia suggested. "Maybe perfect control isn't the goal. Maybe being part of something larger matters more." They decided to say yes, but with conditions. The children's families would need to approve, Mrs. Morrison would need to visit monthly to supervise education, and the arrangement would be trial for this winter only, renewable if it worked well. The response from the families was overwhelming gratitude. The Carlsons and Hendersons were prosperous by frontier standards, but genuinely struggled with educating children while managing the demands of ranching. Having their children receive proper schooling while being safely housed through winter solved multiple problems simultaneously. By early October, they'd prepared for the arrival of 3 additional children. Anna Carlson was Emma's age, quiet and bookish. The Henderson boys, Thomas and James, were 10 and 8 respectively, energetic and good-natured. They arrived with their families a week before the first serious snow, accompanied by supplies their parents sent as payment: salted meat, flour, sugar, fabric, lamp oil, even a proper slate and chalk for lessons. The integration wasn't seamless. The cabin felt crowded suddenly. The noise level increased dramatically. Privacy became a cherished rarity. But the children adapted with the flexibility of youth, establishing routines and territories, working out conflicts with surprising maturity. And Mrs. Morrison proved to be an extraordinary resource. Her monthly visits brought proper lesson plans, books they could share, guidance on teaching methods that actually worked. Under her supervision, Lydia's natural teaching ability developed into genuine skill. The children thrived on the structure and attention, their education progressing at a pace that surprised even their parents. Winter came again, but this year it felt different. The cabin that had felt confining last year now rang with voices and laughter, with arguments over lessons and negotiations about chores, with the complex dynamics of 6 children learning to live together. The work was harder, more cooking, more cleaning, more mediating disputes, but also more rewarding. They weren't just surviving winter, they were creating community. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling steadily outside, 8 people gathered around the table for a celebration that would have been impossible to imagine 2 years ago. They sang carols taught by Mrs. Morrison, ate special treats the children's families had sent, exchanged small handmade gifts. Thomas and James performed a skit they'd written about frontier life. Anna read a story she'd composed. Emma, Rose, and Sarah sang a harmony they'd been practicing for weeks. Watching the children's faces glow in the firelight, listening to their voices blend in imperfect but earnest song, Lydia felt something settle deep in her chest. This was what they'd been building toward, not just survival, not just escape from judgment, but the creation of genuine life. Complex, messy, beautiful life that included others and contributed to something larger than themselves. When the children had finally settled into sleep, Lydia and Caleb sat by the dying fire, exhausted but content. "Margaret would be proud," Caleb said softly. "She wanted the girls to have better than we could give them in Ridge Creek. This," he gestured around the cabin toward the sleeping children in the loft. "This is beyond what she imagined, beyond what I imagined." "She made it possible," Lydia said. "The letter, the land, the vision to see what could be instead of just what was. We're living her dream, in a way. And yours," Caleb added, taking her hand. "You chose this too. You didn't have to. You could have married someone else, somewhere else, had an easier life. But you chose us." "I chose possibility," Lydia corrected, as she had before. "And I got everything that matters." Spring came early that year, or perhaps it just felt that way because they were ready for it. The children's families arrived in April to reclaim their offspring, bringing news and gratitude and requests to continue the arrangement next winter. The cabin felt suddenly empty when they left, but also peaceful, space expanding around the 5 of them in welcome ways. And with spring came a surprise. Mrs. Morrison arrived in May with a proposition. The territorial government was funding a proper school building in Timber Ridge, and they needed a teacher. She was too old for the position, she explained, but she'd recommended Lydia if she was interested. "Me?" Lydia was genuinely shocked. "I'm not a trained teacher." "You're a natural teacher with proven results," Mrs. Morrison countered. "Those children learned more this winter than most children learn in a full year of formal schooling. You have the gift, Mrs. Brennan. The question is whether you want to use it." The position would mean regular travel to Timber Ridge, would mean less time in the valley, would mean exposure and involvement in the larger community. But it would also mean income, would mean official status, would mean contributing meaningfully to territorial development. They discussed it seriously, weighing all the factors. In the end, the decision came down to trust. Trust that the valley would sustain itself. Trust that Caleb could manage the homestead with the girls' help. Trust that they'd built something strong enough to allow for individual growth and contribution. Lydia accepted the position, starting in September when the school year began. And on her first day, walking into a one-room schoolhouse filled with children from scattered homesteads, she understood something profound. The valley had given them refuge when they needed it, had sustained them through the hardest transitions, had become the secure foundation from which they could reach outward. But refuge had never been the final destination. It had been preparation for participating fully in the building of something larger, a community, a territory, a future. 2 summers after that first gathering, they returned to Timber Ridge for the annual celebration, but this time everything was different. They rode 3 horses now, Caleb on the mare, Lydia on the gentle gelding they'd purchased, the girls rotating on the 3rd. Their packs held goods for trade that reflected the valley's true abundance: preserves, dried fruit, vegetables, wool products, even some of the beautiful stones Sarah had insisted were valuable, and which, surprisingly, people actually wanted to buy. As they entered the town square, people called out greetings by name. The girls scattered to find their friends. Caleb was immediately drawn into conversation about some technical aspect of water management, and Lydia found herself surrounded by parents asking about the school year, about their children's progress, about education matters she was increasingly recognized as an authority on. Late in the afternoon, when the trading had concluded and people were settling in for the evening meal, a wagon arrived from the south. Lydia recognized the driver immediately despite 2 years' change, Mr. Hutchins, their former landlord from Ridge Creek. Her heart rate accelerated with old fear, but she held her ground as he approached, his face showing genuine surprise at finding them there. "Mrs. Brennan?" He looked between her and Caleb, clearly trying to reconcile memory with present reality. "I heard you'd settled hereabouts, but I didn't quite believe it." "Mr. Hutchins." Lydia kept her voice level, neutral. "What brings you to Timber Ridge?" "Looking for opportunity," he said frankly. "Ridge Creek is finished. I'm scouting locations for a new start." He paused, then added with what sounded like genuine curiosity, "You've done well for yourselves, it appears." "We've worked hard," Caleb said simply. "Found good land, built a life. That's all." "More than most manage," Hutchins acknowledged. He was quiet for a moment, then surprised them both. "I owe you an apology, I think, for how things were in Ridge Creek, for being quick to evict rather than work with you, for judging circumstances rather than character." The apology hung in the air, unexpected and strangely meaningless. The wound he'd contributed to had healed so completely that his acknowledgement of causing it felt almost irrelevant. "We're grateful for how things turned out," Lydia said carefully. "The eviction forced us to find this place. Sometimes what looks like disaster is actually direction." Hutchins nodded slowly, understanding the gracious dismissal for what it was, and moved on. And watching him walk away, Lydia realized she felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no need for vindication. He was simply a man who'd played a role in a story that had moved past him. That evening, as families gathered for the communal meal and music began to fill the square, Jenkins made his way to where the Brennans sat. "I've been asked to propose something," he said without preamble. "The Territorial Assembly is creating a new county structure. Timber Ridge is to be the county seat. They need people to serve on the governing council, people with stake in the area, with proven ability to build and manage. Your name has been put forward, Brennan, and yours, Mrs. Brennan, for the Education Board." Lydia and Caleb exchanged looks of complete shock. 2 years ago, they'd been evicted as undesirable residents. Now they were being asked to help govern a county. "Why us?" Caleb asked bluntly. "Because you've proven something that matters out here," Jenkins said. "You've taken raw land and made it productive. You've raised children who are a credit to the community. You've contributed without demanding recognition or special treatment. That's the kind of people we need making decisions that affect everyone." They didn't answer immediately, needing time to process the magnitude of what was being offered. But as the evening progressed, as they watched their daughters dance with friends, as they participated in the easy give and take of community life, Lydia began to understand that acceptance was the only possible response. They'd left Ridge Creek as failures by that town's narrow measure. But by the measure that actually mattered, the ability to build life in difficult circumstances, to contribute meaningfully to community, to raise children who would inherit and extend possibility, they had succeeded beyond measure. The valley remained their refuge and foundation, the place they returned to for renewal and privacy. But they were no longer defined by hiding or by escape. They were defined by building, by contributing, by participating in the great work of creating something civilized and good in country that demanded the best of those who chose to inhabit it. On the journey home, as the valley came into view through the trees, creek sparkling, meadow green, cabin solid on its rise, Sarah spoke with the uncomplicated wisdom of childhood. "We're home," she said simply. "We're really, truly home." And Lydia understood that home had never been just the valley, just the cabin, just the land. Home was the complete architecture of their lives, the place they'd claimed, the family they'd become. The community they'd joined, the future they were building through daily choices to contribute rather than merely survive. They had walked away from judgment into unknown country on faith and desperation. They had survived winter in isolation and the terrifying responsibility of stewardship. They had opened their carefully protected space to include others. They had taken refuge and transformed it into foundation. They had turned escape into arrival. The valley spread before them in late summer abundance, offering its gifts with the generosity that had sustained them from the beginning. But they understood now that the valley's greatest gift had never been its resources or its beauty or its isolation. It had been the space to become who they were meant to be, not despite hardship, but through it. Not by avoiding the world, but by building something worth protecting and worth sharing. They rode into the valley as the sun began its descent, painting everything in golden light. Behind them lay the long journey from judgment to acceptance, from poverty to sufficiency, from fear to confidence. Ahead lay years of work and growth, challenges and celebrations, the ordinary, extraordinary business of building good lives in difficult country. But in this moment, riding into the valley that had saved them and that they had saved in return, they were simply home. Complete, sufficient, exactly where they belonged. And that was enough. More than enough. That was everything.